Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Books and Bridges. Thank you for joining us. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. Books and Bridges is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are a community institute of ideas and conversation. And our goal is to provide a platform in which smart people, professors, practitioners, scholars can come and present about what they know, and we engage in discussions, we engage in conversations, and provide lectures, and we span the breadth of the humanities. We try to talk about the best of human thought. And we like to think of ourselves as providing a sort of third space for those who want to kind of step outside the normal environments of their life in society, and step aside from that and join a group of people who are interested in the pursuit of something more universal, something more meaningful. And for the rest of this year, we will be broadcasting all of our events via Zoom because of the pandemic. So that's new for us because mostly we've done everything in a public setting, in a bookstore, in person. And so this is very new to us, but I think it can also be a helpful, intimate discussion setting for all of us. So tonight we will begin our lecture series entitled Treasures of World Literature. And we will begin this by talking about the extraordinarily spiritually sensitive Nobel Prize-winning collection of poetry called Gitanjali by the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore. And I'm your host, Nathan Nielsen, and our guest today is Michael Sowder, scholar, practitioner, professor of sacred literature at Utah State University. Let me just read you his bio. He's a longtime yoga and meditation teacher. He is an award-winning poet, writer, and scholar whose poetry and essays explore themes of spirituality, wilderness, and fatherhood. He has published 4 collections of poetry, a scholarly book on Walt Whitman, An American Religion, and is working on a book for spiritual practitioners, 9 Gates to Enlightenment, Lessons from the World's Wisdom Traditions. Michael is a former blogger for the Huffington Post. His essays and poems appear widely. He travels frequently to India, where in 2014, he lived as a Fulbright Fellow. He is a professor of English at Utah State University, where he teaches courses in the history of yoga and Indian religions. He lives at the foot of the Bear River Mountains with his wife, the writer, Jennifer Senor, and their 2 boys. So Michael, we are very grateful that you could come and teach us tonight. I'll just turn the time over to you, and for all of you participants, after Michael is finished presenting, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button, and we'll have a conversation. So Michael, I turn the time over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. It's my great pleasure to be here. Special thanks to Nathan and for Books and Bridges for having me. It's a real honor. And so tonight we're going to talk about the wonderful Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. And I first encountered Tagore when I started practicing yoga meditation, which was back in the late 1970s, long time ago. And I went to my meditation teacher and I said, what are some books I should read? And he said, well, he said, Autobiography of a Yogi by a Swami Yogananda, and this book called Sadhana by Rabindranath Tagore, which was a collection of lectures that he gave at Harvard when he was visiting the United States back in the early part of the 20th century. And it's a book of philosophical, spiritual essays, and it was a life-changing book for me. So I've been a fan of Tagore for many, many years. And so when Nathan suggested that I talk about Tagore, I was just thrilled. So I was very, very happy. So we're going to talk about Tagore. We're going to talk about his book, Gitanjali. This is my copy. And Gitanjali means song offerings. And so it's a book of lyrical, spiritual poetry. And it's a little bit unique. And so we're going to talk about it. And I'm going to talk a lot about the background and the context and kind of the tradition that Tagore's poetry, especially this volume, comes out of, a tradition called bhakti. And bhakti is a Sanskrit word that means, it has many meanings, but most people describe it as meaning devotion. It means participation and devotion, being a part of. But we'll talk a good bit about that because I feel like an understanding of the spiritual and historical background of this tradition is important for understanding the book. Now, the book is totally accessible. You can just pick it up and read it, and you will, I mean, I'm sure some of you have read it, and it's very moving. So when Tagore came to visit England and he brought this manuscript in 1912, he showed it to the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats, and Yeats couldn't believe how fantastic it was. And Ezra Pound, who was then the editor of Poetry magazine in Chicago, wanted to be the first American magazine to publish Tagore. And so, these poems are really powerful and really accessible. You can just pick it up and you will really feel the power and the sensitivity and just the sense of spiritual longing, the sense of spiritual yearning. So it's a beautiful book of poetry. But to really understand the poetry, I think it's really nice to have a sense of the background, the historical, cultural, and literary background. So we're going to talk about that as well. So we'll talk a little bit about Tagore's life, and then a little bit about Bengal. He came from the state of Bengal during the time of what's known as the Bengali Renaissance, this flourishing of art, culture, literature in Bengal. And Bengal is, there's a funny saying, if I can remember it, they say something like, if you take a pebble and you throw it into a crowd in Bengal, you will hit a poet, no matter who you hit, And so it's like everybody in Bengal is like a poet in a way. So it's a really wonderful part of India. I got to go there a year ago on my birthday, actually in June, and it's just a wonderful place. So anyway, so without further ado, I think I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go through some slides that will talk a little bit about Tagore and about the Bengali Renaissance. And I'll try to stay on time so we have time for questions at the end. And if anybody wants to ask a question while in the middle of the presentation, that would be totally great. Nathan might be able to keep an eye on the chat. If you want to send a question over chat, feel free to interrupt me because kind of having a dialogue is super fun. So I'm happy you can interrupt me, ask any question you want, and then at the end we'll have some designated time for questions and answers. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and see. Now I have a window that says host is disabled, attendee screen sharing. Nathan, do you know what's up with that?
No, I don't.
I wonder if I wonder if you can make me host again and then I could do it. Oh, I'm not hearing you now. Can you unmute yourself? Nathan, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I think I just made you host.
Oh, awesome. Okay, cool.
Go ahead and share.
Perfect. I think we're good now. All right. So now I'm sharing my screen. And here is my first slide. So here we are. Now, probably over to the side of your screen as a viewer, you may have a window that shows me or several of us in a panel of photographs. And usually at the top of that photograph, if you put your cursor over there, you can choose based on one bar or a thicker bar or a couple bars, whether you want to see those faces or not. Okay, so I think you have control over that little panel that has pictures of some of us or all of us. Okay, so here is Rabindranath Tagore. And you can just look into his eyes and you can see this great, great depth. He just has the most beautiful eyes. And when he was a young man, in the course of just a couple years, he lost his wife, a daughter, his son, and his father. And and you can see a deep sadness as well in his eyes. And yet there's a deep kind of spiritual depth in them that I just find it so arresting to gaze into his eyes. Very powerful eyes, very powerful gaze. So he was born in 1861 and died in 1941. So he lived until he was 80. And he was a poet, author, social and religious reformer, and of course, a Nobel laureate. So he was the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. And he received that prize for our book, Gitanjali. He wrote nearly 60 volumes of verse and over 2,000 songs. With Gandhi, he's considered to be one of the architects of modern India. He was knighted by King George V in 1915, but he renounced his knighthood after a British massacre of unarmed civilians in Amritsar. So Amritsar is a city in the northwest in Punjab of India. And he went there when he was a young man with his father, and it was a very powerful spiritual place for him. And when this massacre happened, it affected him very powerfully. Something like 379 civilians were killed and over 1,000 were injured. So all unarmed, but anyway. So this evening, we're going to talk about Tagore's life, about this bhakti tradition in Indian poetry, and then we're going to look at poems from Gitanjali. That's going to be my favorite part. And we won't do it exactly in this order because we're just going to read a poem first. And this is the first poem in the book. I'm not sure how many of you all have the book. Hopefully some of you do. If not, I hope you will get it afterwards. So I'll just read this and we'll just think about what kind of poetry this is. So it's a kind of prayer. All the poems in the book are kind of prayers, really. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and again, and fillest it ever with fresh life. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales, and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy and gives birth to utterance ineffable. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages pass, and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. So it's such a beautiful poem. Has so much reverence and humility and so much sense of just blessedness and grace. It's really, I guess, about grace, right? I'm going to just read it again and maybe talk about a few of the lines as we go through. If anyone has something they would like to share, something that struck them or a favorite line or anything like that, just you can send maybe the chat feature. So, thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. You know, and sometimes I was talking to Nathan a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about this poem, and I was saying that, you know, sometimes you read a poem or even a couple lines from a poem, and I just have the feeling that, you know, you really don't need anything else. You don't need to read anything else. That's enough right there for the rest of your life, you know. I think this first line is like that. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. It's a beautiful line. So, you know, one thing we'll talk about in Indian spirituality is that there is in most, many or most Indian spiritual traditions, there's this notion that within each of us is this divine spark. There's this spark of the divine inside of us. And so there's this sense that we are all immortal, we are all eternal in our deepest core of being. So thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. And then these sweet images of being emptied and being filled. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and again, and fillest it ever with fresh life. There's another poet, I don't know if it was William Blake or Khalil Gibran, who said that, you know, sorrow empties us out and then joy fills our hearts. And without that emptying out, we cannot be filled again. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. This is another beautiful point that you can make about yogic philosophy and Buddhist philosophy, and that is, you know, with every moment, you know, the universe dies and is reborn. Because, as you know, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, you can never step in the same river twice, because every minute, every second, everything has changed molecularly and atomically. And Emerson said, you know, that every view of nature is a thing complete, a vision, a picture that has never been seen before and will never be seen again. And so every moment, you know, when you walk out the front door, everything looks a certain way. It's never looked like that before. It will never look like that again. You know, and so I think this captures that so nicely, that when you feel this inspiration, you know, you feel maybe these melodies that are always eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy and gives birth to utterance ineffable. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages pass, and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. This is a beautiful poem. So I want to now, you know, talk a little bit about his life and this tradition of bhakti, out of which this kind of poem comes.
Hey, Michael, this might be
Yes.
a good time to ask a question.
Yeah.
This is very, very personal poetry. The poet is addressing this poem, these words, this song, in a very personal way. Whom does he imagine himself addressing here?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And actually, during the course of the presentation, we're going to go deeply into that. But it is, you know, it's addressed to God in his conception of God. And in bhakti, there's this wonderful term called Ishtadevata. There's this idea in Indian philosophy, and we'll talk about this more a little bit, that, like, you know, God in God's ultimate reality is like pure spirit, pure consciousness, pure infinite consciousness that informs and fuses with the whole universe, present everywhere. But because that is a kind of formless consciousness, sometimes it's hard to have like a personal relationship to that. And so in Indian spirituality, there's the wonderful notion called the Ishtadevata, which means your cherished image for the divine. And so it's like, we'll talk about this in a couple minutes, but it's like you kind of can choose whatever is your highest spiritual ideal or highest spiritual image, which can be that for you. And so we'll talk about this as we go. So I love that question. It's an awesome, awesome question. All right, so thank you. And everyone feel free to ask questions because it's really fun when we have a dialogue. So I just wanted to show on the map where Tagore's from. He's from West Bengal, which is right in here. And West Bengal was split from East Bengal in, I think, 1901 as two different states. And then with the independence of India from Britain in 1947, there was a larger partition where Bangladesh became its own country. Well, Bangladesh and Pakistan became one country. These were the two Muslim parts of India. Both of these were part of India back before 1947. They were majority Muslim. And so in this deal, Gandhi was very much against it, but the deal was worked out that Pakistan and Bangladesh would split off from India because they are majority Muslim, and then the majority Hindu, the rest of India would stay its own country. Then not too long after that, Bangladesh and Pakistan split as well. So now they're separate countries. So, but the Tagore family had land actually in what is now Bangladesh. Here's a close-up of West Bengal. Here's Bangladesh. Here's Kolkata, used to be called Calcutta. Now it's called Kolkata. They're trying to, in a lot of the cities, return to the original names. So here's just a few facts about Tagore's early life. He was born into a sophisticated Brahmin, this is the highest class, land-owning family. He became a poet, writer, composer, artist. And this is so amazing and so cool. He wrote the national anthems for both India and Bangladesh. So he's the only person who's ever written national anthems for two different countries. So he was just a great creative person. He was a composer. He wrote both the lyrics and the music for these anthems. So he was raised mostly by servants. His mother died when he was young. And someday I'd like to really explore this, investigate it. It's just something I've noticed, but a lot of really famous people that I read about lost one or both parents when they were very young. You know, it's just something that I keep noticing. I'm going to have to study it sometime and figure that out. But anyway, so his home was actually like a cultural center for the Bengali Renaissance, which we'll talk about in just a minute. He was educated at home mostly by tutors. He was enrolled in several schools, but he never succeeded in schools. He couldn't stand the rigidity and the formality of regular schools. So he began writing poetry at an early age. At 16, he published his first collection under a pseudonym, Banu Sinha, which means lion of light. So pretty awesome pseudonym. And so it's been said that his earliest influences that shaped his poetic sensibility were the artistic environment of his home. So he came from a home of highly cultured artists. There were poets, musicians, dancers, singers. He just grew up in this atmosphere of creativity. Everybody was a creative person. His father, very famous social reformer and poet, writer himself. Then other influences were the beauty of nature. He was, you can tell that from Gitanjali. He's very much in love with the beauty of nature. And then the saintly character of his father. He wrote, most members of my family had some gift. Some were artists, some poets, some musicians, and the whole atmosphere of our home was permeated with the spirit of creation. Doesn't that sound wonderful? So like with the pandemic, like, okay, we have this opportunity to create that in our own homes. We can all become poets and artists and, you know, instead of just like eating Cheetos and watching TV or something. Okay, so again, oh yeah, and this is important. So he later wrote that he was born and brought up in an atmosphere of the confluence of three movements, all of which were revolutionary. One, a religious reform movement started by Ramohan Roy and Tagore's father. And they founded this organization called the Brahmo Samaj, which I'll just say a word about in a minute. Then second was this literary revolution that is often, excuse me, referred to as the Bengali Renaissance. And his family, his parents were deeply involved in this Bengali literary renaissance. And then the Indian national movement, which was people who were arguing for and trying to work for the independence of India from the British Empire. So here is the literary revolution called the Bengali Renaissance. So it was a cultural, social, intellectual, and artistic movement in Bengal during the 19th and 20th centuries, begun by this figure, Raja. He was later called Raja, which means king or great king, Ram Mohan Roy. And Roy was the founder of this organization called the Brahmo Samaj with Tagore's father, Devendranath. And this was an attempt to reform Hinduism as it was being practiced at the time. So it was a reform that was monotheistic, and it sought to move Indian religion away from polytheism, from murti or idol worship, from caste restrictions, and many of the formal ritual practices of traditional Brahmanical Hinduism. So Brahmanical is a word that refers to the Brahmin priests. You know, there are 4 castes traditionally in India. The Brahmins are the highest class, the priests. And then we have the Kshatriyas, who were the warriors or the nobles. Then we had the Vaishyas, which were the tradespeople and merchants, and the Shudras, who were the workers. And, you know, we grow up thinking, oh, how terrible this is. And it is and was and has been for a very long time. But I had this realization one day, I'm sure other people realize it, but, you know, these are the same 4 classes that existed in medieval Europe. You know, so like in medieval Europe, we had the Catholic priests, then we had the nobles, the knights, and the kings. They were another class. And then we had the tradespeople, and then we had the serfs who were working the land. So we had the same 4 classes in medieval Europe that were founded in India. And this is not necessarily an accident, because both Indian culture and European culture come from a ancestor culture called the Indo-European people, or the Indo-Aryan people. Sanskrit is related to Greek and Latin and all European languages. And so, you know, if you're studying Sanskrit, you'll realize that it has a lot of similarities with English. Subject, verb, object, tenses are the same. A lot of the structures are the same. We have very many cognate words, so words that are almost identical in Sanskrit and English and German and Greek and Latin. So we all come from this same language family and this same ancient cultural family of the Indo-Europeans. So anyway, it's not an accident that we had this 4-part class system in medieval Europe, and there's this 4-part caste system in India, which still exists, but Indians are trying to get past it. Anyway, didn't mean to go into all that. But anyway, so Tagore is often considered the culmination and flowering of this Bengali Renaissance. Okay, so at one point he was sent to England for a Western education. This was very common among the upper class in India at the time, but he never graduated. He just could not really accept the strictures of traditional schooling. So he came back without a degree. But he was writing and publishing poetry and starting to write novels and stories at the time. And then, like I said, in the first decade of the 20th century, he lost his father, his wife, a daughter, and a son. So his first book of poetry, or like they say, notable book, is this one called Evening Songs, which were full of sadness and pain, which sought expression in these poems. And then this book was closely followed by this book called Prabhat Sangeet, which is morning songs, in which he celebrated his joy at the discovery of the world around him. Now, just checking the time. Okay, so I need to hurry. So he had a profound spiritual experience that changed his life. And I just wanted to read this account. He says, as I continued to gaze, he was looking at a scene of nature. As I continued to gaze, all of a sudden, a covering seemed to fall away from my eyes, and I found the world bathed in a wonderful radiance with waves of beauty and joy swelling on every side. This radiance pierced in a moment through the folds of sadness and despondency which had accumulated over my heart and flooded it with this universal light. He later wrote, I felt sure that some being who comprehended me and my world was seeking his best expression in all my experiences, uniting them into an ever-widening individuality, which is a spiritual work of art. He called this being his Jivan Devata. This is like the term I mentioned earlier, Ishta Devata, which means like your own personal experience or image for God or the divine. So his poetry, he's considered to have blended and synthesized the aesthetics of the English Romantics, the visions of the great mystics of India, metaphysical quest of the sages of the Upanishads, these ancient sacred scriptures of India, the aesthetic sensibilities of some of the ancient poets, and the devotional spirit of bhakti. And so I want to talk about bhakti just a little bit. So important. So bhakti is usually defined as devotion. So it's a spiritual tradition focused on an intense, intimate, loving relationship with the divine. One of the first mentions of bhakti is in the Bhagavad Gita, probably the most famous scripture of India, where Krishna says, you know, of all the yogas you can do, you should do bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of love. So then some centuries later in southern India and Tamil Nadu, a powerful bhakti movement arose in the 6th and 7th centuries. And over the next centuries, it spread throughout the subcontinent. This bhakti is characterized by an intense, personal, intimate, and emotional relationship with God, the divine. However you see that divine, because you can have your own image for it. So it's a tradition centered in the heart. It arose as part of a kind of countercultural response to traditional Brahmanical Hinduism. It was iconoclastic. It was opposed to caste and gender discrimination. It was against ritual and rigid document. It was often lower class people and women and outcasts and shudras who all were writing and celebrating this kind of like a Great Awakening. You know, we had a first Great Awakening, second Great Awakenings in America. It's kind of like one of these spiritual awakenings. Bhakti employs poetry, music, singing, dance, art, and other practices that heighten these devotional feelings for the divine. Now, this is this term that I mentioned before, Ishta Devata, and it means one's cherished image for the divine. So God, in his, her, its absolute form, is pure spirit, beyond concept, beyond name, beyond form. But you can have a personal image of the deity that acts as your doorway into that absolute divinity. So this is your Ishta Devata. You get to choose. So like for a Hindu or a practitioner in India, you can choose your Ishta Devata. You know, there are Indians whose Ishta Devata is Jesus or Buddha or Lakshmi or Shiva, Krishna, all these different, you know, there are 330 million gods and goddesses, it's said, in India. So it's a very user-friendly kind of religion. You can choose your image. One of my favorite gurus of the 20th century, who was from southern India, Ramana Maharshi, his Ishta Devata was this mountain, Arunachala. So your Ishta Devata doesn't even have to be like a anthropomorphic image. It can be a river, it can be a mountain, it can be love, it can be peace, something like that, even a mantra. So your Ishta Devata is your own image for the divine. So getting back to Nathan's question, you know, I think that because of this organization called the Brahmo Samaj, Tagore was really kind of against idol worship and having all these images that people worship. And he had more of a, I think he had more of a spirit image for God, more than like a physical kind of bodily image. So in bhakti, you can have all these different kinds of relationships to God. God can be like a friend, or you can be like a servant with a master. One of my favorite bhakti poets from Maharashtra is Tulsidas, and he wrote all these poems in which he is God's dog. And so it's like, oh dear Lord, you know, I just want to be your dog. I want to sit at your feet and I want to hear your soft voice and you give me some pets once in a while. So in bhakti, you can even have a relationship of like master to dog, and that works good too. It can be child to father. You can see the divine as your father. You can see the divine as your mother. And then a lot of women, you know, will think of like the baby Krishna, who is like an incarnation of God, of Vishnu. They will worship or venerate their Ishtadevata as Krishna the child. So it's kind of like Jesus in the manger, you know, you can have this devotional feeling toward that baby. And, or it can be father to a child. And then it's said that the very highest relationship you can have toward the divine is like a lover to a beloved. And so it's like, you know, you can just feel like when you're like in high school or you're young and you fall in love with somebody and you have this infatuation with them, and you know, you can just dream and daydream about them. And so it's said that if you have a relationship like that with God, it's the very highest intimate relationship you can have. So another interesting thing is that you all have probably heard of poets like Rumi and Hafiz, these Muslim Sufi poets. And you know that India was dominated by the Mughals, this Muslim people, for about 400 years. And many of the Muslims in India at the time were Sufis. And Sufis have a very similar sensibility in their poetry and in their devotion. They have a very bhakti-like, devotional, sweet relationship with God. And so the Sufis and the Bhaktas, the Bhakti people, they got along very, very well. So it was a really nice connection. So I think that's beautiful. And then a lot of these poems, you know, also, I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of the Christian mystic poets like John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila. They also had a very intimate, personal, loving kind of devotional relationship and wrote poetry. And so there's, you know, I like to find these parallels among the different religions. This quote from Kabir, I think, sums up the bhakti spirit when he says, it is the longing that does all the work. So we have this longing for home. We have this longing to return to this place of the spirit, this longing for this, you know, companionship and love with the divine because it's our home. And so Kabir says it's the longing that does all the work, the yearning itself. I just think that's awesome. So here is one of Gitanjali. Let me check the time. Okay, I'm gonna need to be done in just a minute. In the deep shadows of rainy July, with secret steps, thou walkest, silent as night, eluding all watchers. Today the morning has closed its eyes, heedless of the calls of the loud east wind, and a thick veil has been drawn over the ever-wakeful blue sky. The woodlands have hushed their songs, and doors are all shut at every house. Thou art the solitary wayfarer in the deserted street. Oh, my only friend, my best beloved, the gates are open in my house. Do not pass by like a dream. So beautiful. And that sense, you can feel that longing at the end, that yearning. Do not pass by my house that has its door open, its gates open for thee. So you can feel that bhakti spirit. I have another one here. And in this one is like addressing the divine as a mother, you know, and because your Ishtadevata doesn't even need to like stay the same. You know, you can love the divine as a mother and as a father and as a master, you know. And so, mother, I shall weave a chain of pearls for thy neck with my tears of sorrow. The stars have wrought their anklets of light to deck thy, sorry, that should be thy, to deck thy feet, but mine will hang upon thy breast. Wealth and fame come from thee, and it is for thee to give or to withhold them. But this, my sorrow, is absolutely mine own. And when I bring it to thee as my offering, thou rewardest me with thy grace. And you can sense that longing. Saint Teresa of Avila, this 16th century Spanish mystic and really bhakta, she says, tears accomplish everything. Tears accomplish everything. It's kind of like Tagore saying, it's the yearning, the longing that does all the work. A lot of bhakti poems are like, oh Lord, why have you left me? Kind of like David in the Psalms, the Psalms are very much like this as well. Nathan reminded me of that. So let's see, I have a couple more slides. Oh yeah, so Nehru, who was the first prime minister of India, he said, Tagore and Gandhi have undoubtedly been the two outstanding and dominating figures of the first half of the 20th century. Tagore's influence over the mind of India, and especially of successive rising generations, has been tremendous. Not Bengali only, the language in which he himself wrote, but all the modern languages of India have been molded partly by his writings. More than any other Indian, he has helped to bring into harmony the ideals of the East and the West and broaden the bases of Indian nationalism. And then just my last slide, Tagore on his 70th birthday, he said, I have, it is true, engaged myself in a series of activities, but the innermost me is not to be found in any of these. At the end of the journey, I'm able to see a little more clearly the orb of my life. Looking back, the only thing of which I feel certain is that I am a poet. So thank you all very much. That ends my presentation, and I think we still may have some time for questions, question and answer time. So I am going to stop sharing, and I am going to see if I can turn the chairship, the hostship back to, oh, Nathan. Yes. All right, Nathan, I think you're host again.
Okay. Well, Michael, thank you very much. If anyone has a question, please feel free to submit that. I actually have a question as we wait for people to submit their questions. One thing that really struck me, I think it's probably one of the most beautiful concepts and ideas in this book, is that on the one hand, the poet is looking at the divine as someone who encompasses everything, someone in whom all of his hopes are kind of invested. But yet there's another sense in which the poet and the divine are partners. They are co-creators of beauty. And I think it's in 73, poem 73, in which he talks of the pageant of you and me. The great pageant of thee and me has overspread the sky. And so tell us a little bit more about what this partnership, co-creativity really means. And that's a beautiful part of it.
That is a gorgeous line you just read, and just a gorgeous thought to think about. I think in some ways it goes back to that first poem where he says, you carry me over hills and dales, and I'm this flute reed, and then when you blow through me, I make this beautiful music, so I think that it's really interesting. I mean, in Taoism, there's this concept of wu wei, which is doing without doing. And it's kind of like the idea is that we try to get quiet and we try to be receptive. And then it's like this inspiration moves through us, and we feel like we are a kind of instrument, in the hands of the divine. And so it's a kind of co-creation that our ego has to get out of the way. And once our ego gets out of the way, then like this deep reservoir of creativity and spirituality, I think can shine forth. In Kundalini Yoga, I once heard this teacher say that, like, if you want to be a teacher, the first thing to remember is that you have to be zero. That you have to just be zero and let, the teachings come through you, and so I don't know if that's a little different than what he's saying, but there is this like beautiful dance, you might say, or this beautiful communion. Bhakti also means like participation. And so it's like that we participate in that creation. That's a beautiful thought. Yeah, I love that. I'm going to mark that poem too. I have so many marked.
But I have to say, I think my favorite poem in his collection was poem 35.
35. Let's look at that.
It speaks to me, at least, about just the state of the world, the state of anxiety that people feel about, at least in our country, about where we are.
Yes. Do you want to read that for us?
Yeah, sure. He says, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
Wow.
It's just, that's rousing.
Yeah, that's just fantastic. So beautiful. You know, and I mean, if you want to think about as a writer, rhetorically, you know, it's just so nice the way he sets up these phrases, these adverbial phrases, you know, where this and where this and where this, and then at the end, into that heaven of freedom. And then we realize he's addressing someone too, you know, my Father, let my country awake, with an imperative at the end. Oh, that's just awesome writing. And it's really some words that are made for our time today.
Yeah, there's a sense in which this collection of poetry could be really applicable to anyone of any religion.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's universalist, I think,
yes.
in its sentiments, its feelings.
Yes, it really is. And this was actually, you know, even a kind of a conscious part of this Bengali Renaissance, that to realize that these deep spiritual truths are universal. You know, so Yogananda, who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, this other book that I was talking about earlier, you know, he is constantly noting parallels between Christianity and yoga or Hinduism. And yeah, it was very much a conscious program almost, you know, to really say that these teachings don't belong to India, they belong to the world, you know, and they're a kind of universal, perennial kind of truth.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we have a question.
Awesome.
From the inimitable Mandy Green.
All right.
She asks, how has your study of this poet and his work shaped your own spirituality and perception of the divine? Which words or phrases have planted themselves in your soul?
Beautiful question. This book was so important to me when I was young, a new yogi practicing meditation and yoga. And, you know, it just, I think it kind of opened my heart to a new kind of way of having a relationship with God or the divine. That I was raised Catholic. I had 12 years of Catholic education, and you know, I kind of rejected Catholicism when I was in high school, and you know, and then I found books like this, and you know, I can just look at that very first poem again. I mean, just this kind of sweet, intimate, loving kind of relationship with the divine. You know, I had so much of this, like, I don't know, like I just felt like these giant cathedrals, as beautiful as they were, they could just crash down on me because of my sin or something, you know? So like I very much had this this deep awareness of human sin and original sin and all that. And, you know, while there's the beautiful love of Jesus that is, you know, in the New Testament and everything, it was hard for me to have this level of sweetness. You know, there's just a kind of sweetness there where there's no fear, there's no like worry, there's just this beautiful intimacy. And I think it just opened my heart in that way to see that you know, there is this there's this and the fact that it seemed to be speaking from experience and not from some kind of doctrinal teaching, you know, that it seemed to come truly from the poet's heart. I felt like he knew God, you know what I mean? I felt like he had some experience of the divine, that it wasn't like a mental concept, or it wasn't a kind of scriptural teaching that he had memorized and was restating, but it was coming just spontaneously and purely from his heart. It was something he spoke of that he knew. You know, I felt like he had some experience that I wanted. You know, it's like, what is this experience that he's had? And I want that, you know? And so I think those are some ways that he really affected me a lot.
And as we wait for other people to ask questions,
Mm-hmm.
one thing that struck me in this collection is just the almost heavy presence of waiting. The poet is waiting and waiting, but there's a sweetness. There's almost he almost savors and saves up the waiting, because it's going to add pleasure to the eventual, you know, union.
Mm-hmm.
And there are moments in which the poet seems to kind of make contact with the divine, fleeting. But it does seem to me that it's almost like the experience of waiting is kind of the point,
Yeah.
in a way. What do you think? I don't know.
I know, I think that's really true. It's kind of like a vigil, you know, it's almost like he's sitting in his, well, I mean, he came from a wealthy family, but, you know, you can just imagine him sitting in his hut with a candle burning, you know, and he's just waiting for the Lord, the divine to come. And, you know, I guess like you can think about, if you take it back to that lover and beloved image, and that sense of, you're going to see your girlfriend or boyfriend in like a half an hour or in an hour. And it's like the anticipation is almost as fun and as beautiful as the actual, seeing them. So I think that's part of it, that it's like you're so like looking forward and excited, you know. But then also, I have heard bhaktas, you know, these devotional people say that the longing and the fulfillment are the same thing, you know, and so that there's this kind of that the very longing itself is a kind of immersion in that feeling of being with the divine. So, yeah,
So we have a question
good.
from Philip Severin. He
Oh my
asks,
gosh, Phil, hello. An old friend from my lawyer days.
oh, that's great. That's
Phil?
great.
Yeah.
So he wants to know, was there a development in his style or the content of his writings as he got older?
Yeah, there was actually. And great question. So, you know, he was writing in the early part of the 20th century. And this was the period of modernism and kind of like the dominance of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound in Anglophone or English speaking literature. And so Pound and Eliot, they were very much influenced by classical Chinese poetry and East Asian poetry, which is very much centered on the image, you know, the strength of a really clear, powerful image. And Pound said, they read a lot of haiku and poems like that. And Ezra Pound said, it's better to create one image than to create volumes of poetry. And so there's this emphasis on clear, hard, almost hard surfaced images. And this earlier poetry of Tagore is not so much like that. It's a little bit more, more like the poets of the late 19th century. He was very much influenced by the Romantic poets who are, very spiritually oriented, but they tend to be a little more abstract, and so later in his life, toward the end of his life, he wrote much more kind of image-based, a little harder edged kinds of poems. So his poetry did evolve in that way, definitely. These early poems, they have imagery in them, they have scene, they have settings, but there's a lot more abstraction, than became the kind of norm which still exists today. Poets today are very much focused on presenting really clear images. So anyway, I hope that is a okay answer. Great to hear from you, Phil. It's been a long time. We'll have to connect outside of the webinar. Thank you.
We have about, I don't know, 5-10 minutes left.
Great.
We can wait for more questions to come in.
Okay.
But if you don't mind, I would like to just point us to the very end where he's basically preparing for his death.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, he's welcoming his death. And after all these years of longing and yearning and waiting, there's no sense of disappointment. There's only a sense of, and a phrase he uses strikes me a lot. It's the shores of the endless shores of worlds, I think is what he says. Children play on the endless shores of worlds. And oftentimes he talks about hearing the faint melodies of music from the endless shores. But you mentioned this image, this fascination with images. The very last image of the whole collection is this. He says, like a flock of homesick cranes flying night and day back to their mountain nests, let all my life take its voyage to its eternal home in one salutation to thee.
Mm. So beautiful. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting that there's no sense of like loss with the death. It's just a transition.
Mm-hmm. Definitely a going home, and I love the way, in India, there's a lot of prostration happening. So like people will touch the feet of a saint, touch the feet of a guru, a teacher, and people will do full prostration before an altar. And so there's a lot of prostration that goes on. And so I love the way this poem is kind of structured around that prostration. It says, in one salutation to thee, my God, let all my senses spread out and touch this world at thy feet. And then at the end, like you read, Nathan, like a flock of homesick cranes. It's so beautiful, flying night and day back to their mountain nests. Let all my life take its voyage to its eternal home in one salutation to thee. One of the great themes in bhakti poetry and Sufi poetry and Christian mystical poetry is this idea of surrender. This idea of just total surrender to the divine and the will of the divine, and just this idea of becoming an instrument. And so I just love that at the end, and there's no sense of loss or no sense of sadness or anything, but it's just sense of homecoming, this beautiful homecoming. So.
Well, we can wait a little while for any more questions to come in.
All right.
But I just have to say that, Michael, that you've really opened up a new world of thought and poetry to us. And
I'm glad.
I guess I didn't know that Tagore was so instrumental and influential in just the life of India, the political life, the self-identity of Indians. I mean, that's a very, we tend to associate India with Gandhi,
Right, right, exactly.
but so Gandhi, he's more of the political reformer, but behind all reform, it really is a poet
Yeah,
in
right.
most cases.
Uh-huh. It's
Every
very,
kind of revolution requires a poet, I would
yeah,
say.
yeah. Like Jose Marti in Cuba, well, before not the Castro Revolution, but the one where Cuba got independence from Spain
Mm.
a few centuries ago. Jose Marti was a great poet, and so yeah, Garcia Lorca in Spain, so poet of the of that kind of revolution. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
That was actually the original conception of this series, was to explore how different countries kind of have their own national scripture, so to speak, like
Hmm.
secular scripture.
Hmm.
And it seems like Tagore kind of occupies that position in some way.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then in America, Walt Whitman, he wanted to be the epic poet and great, heroic bard of America. And I think he succeeded in that. He's kind of like seen as the grandfather of contemporary poetry, and then Emily Dickinson, the grandmother. So the two of them together. And I did my dissertation in one scholarly book on Whitman. So he
Mm.
definitely wanted to write the New American Bible. He called it Leaves of Grass. He sometimes called it the New American Bible. So
Oh,
he definitely wanted to write such a kind of secular scripture.
wow, I
And
didn't
yeah,
know.
Tagore very much that way, and he was very, even though he came from an aristocratic kind of family, he was very much in touch with the common simple people as well, and wrote about common simple people a lot. So probably mostly.
Mm.
So yeah, he's just a beautiful soul, just beautiful. You can see it in his eyes. His eyes
Yeah.
are so amazing.
Do you think any other works of Indian literature represent a major kind of repository of Indian identity?
Oh, things have just changed so much, over the over the years, and like I think of Salman Rushdie and Midnight's Children and books like that that have been so influential in kind of like redefining Indian identity after partition, and so I think it's evolving. India is a very big country. I mean, geographically, it's like about 1/3 the size of the U.S., but it has, I think, 1.3 billion people, so it has about a fifth of the world's population, the world's largest democracy, and so I think there are more and more um, kind of like works that represent the complexity of India. There's I think about a 15% Muslim population, which struggles a lot right now under the current. There's kind of a nationalistic government again in India under Narendra Modi, and so they're having a lot of the same issues we're having now. So,
Mm. Mm.
but yeah, but Tagore's, and I think Tagore among a lot of literary writers in Italy, in India right now, is probably not as revered as he once was. Because India has become so much more secular and so much more westernized, and for a lot of kind of literary intellectuals, he tends to hark back to this kind of simpler, maybe more religious kind of time. And so I think his religious, more spiritual verse is probably not in as much favor as it once was, so. But that's a generalization too, because he's still much loved by most people probably. So
Yeah.